This is the story of Raymond Elliott Voss and his wife, Deborah Ann Voss. They had been married for 22 years, long enough for love to stop announcing itself and simply become the furniture of daily life. Raymond was a structural engineer who had built his marriage the same way he built bridges, load-bearing, precise, designed for permanence. Deborah was a woman who had once wanted to be wanted in a way that made her feel electric. And somewhere along the years, she had confused electricity with love and quietly blamed Raymond for the stillness. Their son Nathan was 24, old enough to have opinions and young enough for them to be wrong. What unraveled between his parents would cost all three of them something they hadn't known they were carrying. And what they would each learn, they would learn alone, in the slow and ordinary way that truth tends to arrive, not like lightning, but like the tide. The kitchen at 6:45 in the morning looked the same as it had for a decade. Raymond stood at the counter with his second cup of coffee, scanning structural load estimates on his tablet. Deborah moved around him with practiced ease, reaching past his elbow for the creamer, rinsing her mug, setting it in the drying rack with a small, precise click. They had their choreography down. They did not need to speak much before 8 o'clock, and they didn't. "There's leftover pasta in the blue container," she said, pulling her jacket from the hook near the door. "Thanks." He didn't look up. "Will you be late?" "Probably. The Harmon account is presenting today." He nodded. She left. The door closed behind her with its usual soft compression of air, and Raymond sat with his coffee in the quiet that followed her out. And he told himself, as he had told himself for years, that this was what a settled marriage looked like, that the absence of friction meant the presence of peace. Their home in Cedar Falls was the kind of house that photographed beautifully. A craftsman with a wide porch, 2 mature oaks in the front yard, window boxes Deborah had planted with lavender in the spring. Raymond had renovated the kitchen himself, laying the subway tile on weekends over 2 summers. He was proud of it in the way men are proud of things they've built with their hands. Deborah had appreciated it once, running her fingertips along the grout lines the first morning it was finished. That was 4 years ago. They still shared a bed. They still had dinner together most nights. On Sundays, they watched the British baking show she liked, and Raymond would make a remark about the technical challenge that made her laugh in a small, involuntary way, the laugh she couldn't always help. He held on to those moments without examining them too closely. It was in October that Deborah started mentioning her colleague Philip for the first time. Not unusually, not suspiciously. He came up the way coworkers do in the organic drift of dinner conversation. Philip thought the Harmon pitch was too conservative. Philip's been pushing for a younger client base. Philip organized this ridiculous team-building thing with escape rooms. Raymond half listened with the interest of a man who found other people's offices faintly tedious. He asked a question or two. The conversations moved on. Philip, it emerged over several weeks, was 36. 8 years younger than Deborah, 12 younger than Raymond. He had apparently worked in New York before moving back to Iowa to be closer to his mother. Raymond formed only the vaguest impression of him. Young, ambitious, restless in the way people were when they still believed they needed to prove things. Nathan came home that November weekend for his cousin's engagement party, and at dinner on Saturday night he'd been in good spirits, talking about his apartment in Des Moines, a promotion he was angling for, a girl he'd been seeing named Claire. Raymond listened and asked questions and refilled everyone's wine. Deborah was animated in the way she sometimes was. Around Nathan, her face opening up, her hands moving when she talked. Raymond watched her and felt something he couldn't quite name. Not jealousy exactly, but something adjacent to it. The awareness that she was more herself with their son in the room than she was with just him. After Nathan left Sunday morning, the house settled back into its rhythms. Deborah went upstairs to change. Raymond washed the dishes. When she came back down in jeans and an oversized sweater he didn't recognize, he looked up. "Is that new?" She glanced down at herself. "This? No, I've had it a while." She moved to the couch and picked up her book. Raymond dried his hands on the dish towel and looked at her for a moment. at the way she was already somewhere else, already deep inside the page, and he had the sudden, vertiginous sensation that he was standing just outside a room she had locked from the inside. He hung the dish towel on the oven handle and went to his office to finish his drawings for the week. He didn't think about it again until he had reason to. January arrived with its gray particular light, and Raymond noticed, in the sideways way he noticed most things, that Deborah had begun to take better care of herself, not in an alarming way, not in a way that invited comment. She had always been attractive, had always dressed well for work, but there was something new in the attention she was paying, something that had shifted from maintenance to intention, a different perfume. Gym clothes left drying in the laundry room on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, which were new days. Her phone, once left casually on the kitchen counter or the coffee table, had begun traveling with her from room to room. He told himself this meant nothing. He believed it, or he chose to, which was not quite the same thing. In February, they drove together to his brother Paul's 50th birthday dinner in Ames. 2 hours there, 2 hours back. Raymond had always liked long drives with Deborah. She'd been good company in cars, more talkative than usual, the motion of travel loosening something in her. But on the drive to Paul's she looked out the passenger window for long stretches, and the conversation came in short, self-contained bursts that didn't build into anything. "How's Paul feeling about 50?" she asked. "He says fine. I think he's lying." She smiled briefly at the glass. "Milestone birthdays are strange. Are you dreading yours?" "Not dreading it." A pause. "I just wonder sometimes what I've done with it." He glanced at her. "With what?" "All of it." She shifted in her seat. "I don't know. Never mind." He wanted to press her, but something in her tone, sealed, self-sufficient, told him she hadn't offered an opening. She'd made a brief appearance at her own inner life and then closed the door again. Raymond turned his eyes back to the road and let the silence do what it wanted. "What I've done with it." The sentence stayed with him that night, and later, lying awake at 2 in the morning while Deborah slept beside him with her back toward his side of the bed, he found himself wondering what she had expected her life to feel like by now. They had a good home, security, a son they were both proud of, a marriage without cruelty, without chaos. He had built things. He had been faithful and present and steady. He couldn't quite understand what else it was she might have meant. That, he would later understand, was precisely the problem. He saw Philip for the first time at Deborah's company's spring mixer in March. Raymond shook hands across the table of appetizers and formed his impression quickly. Tall, easy in his own skin, the kind of handsome that came less from features than from confidence worn lightly. He had a way of listening that made the person he was listening to feel like the most interesting person at the party. Raymond had watched him do it with 3 different people before Deborah appeared at his elbow and made introductions. "Philip, this is my husband Raymond." "Ray." He didn't correct it. "I've heard good things." Philip smiled. "Only good things? Then she's being generous." Raymond looked at Deborah. She was looking at Philip, and she was smiling in a way Raymond recognized, the involuntary kind, the kind that can't be manufactured. But in that moment, he only filed it away. He did not name what he saw. He thought instead about whether to try the bruschetta and decided against it. They drove home in near silence. Raymond said the salmon had been overcooked. Deborah said she hadn't tried it. They went to bed without further inventory of the evening. 2 weeks later, he found the text message. He had not been looking. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter while she was in the shower, and he glanced at it from across the room out of nothing more than reflex, the way anyone does. The preview was 2 lines from a contact labeled PW. Last night was, "I keep thinking about your laugh." Then it cut off. Raymond stood in the kitchen for a long moment. The shower ran upstairs. The refrigerator hummed. He looked out the window at the 2 oaks in the front yard, their branches still bare in the March cold. He set his coffee cup down carefully and went to his office and sat behind his desk and did not think for nearly 15 minutes. Just sat, very still, the way certain structures can absorb stress invisibly. bending at a cellular level while the surface remains unchanged. He waited a week. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps because naming it would force a consequence, and he wasn't ready for the consequence. He went to work. He came home. He watched her moving through the house, and he watched himself watching her. And the distance between them took on a new quality. It was still quiet, but now it had depth. It was a well rather than a floor. He chose a Wednesday evening, after dinner, when the dishes were done and Deborah had settled on the couch with her phone. He sat down in the armchair across from her and said, without preamble, "Who is Philip to you?" She looked up. Something moved through her expression. Not guilt exactly, but the recognition that the conversation she had known was coming had now arrived. She set the phone face down on the cushion beside her. "Ray, I'm not asking to fight," he said. "I want to understand." She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful. "He makes me feel like a person." Raymond absorbed this. As opposed to what? As opposed to... She stopped. Started again. "You're a good man. I know that. But somewhere in the last 10 years, I became part of the infrastructure of your life. I'm the pasta in the blue container. I'm the person who confirms what time something starts. I'm not..." She pressed her lips together. "I don't feel seen. I haven't for a long time. You could have said that to me. I did. In different ways." He thought about that. He thought about the drive to Paul's birthday. The what have I done with it? The locked room he'd felt standing in the kitchen. "I didn't understand what you were saying." "No," she agreed. "You didn't." The honesty of it hung between them, and Raymond did not know what to do with the fact that she was both right and wrong. Right, that he had missed her. Wrong, that the answer had been Philip. He looked at her face, which he had looked at for 22 years, and felt something in his chest quietly settle, the way a building gives way, not at the peak of the storm, but after, when the wind finally stops and the damage becomes visible. "How long?" he asked. She looked down at her hands. "Since November." He nodded slowly. He felt many things. Grief, anger, a terrible sadness for both of them, but he felt them quietly, the way he felt most things, inwardly and without performance. He stood up from the armchair. "I need some time," he said, "to think about what I want." She looked up at him. Her eyes were bright, uncertain. He thought she might say she was sorry. She didn't. He went upstairs and lay down on the bed in the dark, still in his clothes, staring at the ceiling. He was 51 years old. His wife had told him she didn't feel seen, and he was trying, in the dark, to understand what he had been looking at instead. He called Nathan the following weekend, not to report or recruit, simply because he needed to hear a familiar voice. Nathan asked how things were, and Raymond said things were complicated. And Nathan, perceptive enough to understand that an elaboration was being withheld, said he'd come home the following weekend. He did come, and Deborah, who had moved with visible discomfort through the week since the conversation, sat across from their son, and let it come out over 2 hours in halting, justified, human pieces. She spoke of loneliness, of feeling invisible, of reaching for something she hadn't known she needed until it was offered. Nathan listened. Raymond sat at the far end of the table and said very little. At some point, Nathan turned to him and said, "Dad, will you really?" That checked out. "Like, she's been trying to tell you." Raymond looked at his son. He thought about the years he'd spent building and maintaining and providing, all the ways he'd expressed love that were not the language she needed, and he said simply, "I won't compete anymore." Nathan stared at him. "That's it? That's all you have to say?" "Yes." Deborah moved out in April. Not dramatically. She found a sublet 4 miles away, a 1-bedroom above a dry cleaner, and she took what she needed and left what she didn't. Raymond stood in the hallway and watched 2 boxes go out the door and did not stop her, because he had decided, quietly, without announcing the decision to anyone, that he was no longer willing to hold anyone in place. For the first month, Nathan was cool to him. Not cruel, but distant in the particular way of someone who has chosen a side and is trying not to examine the choice too carefully. He called his mother more. He made a trip to visit her in the sublet and reported back, as though Raymond had asked, that she seemed to be doing all right. Raymond said, "Good," and meant it. He went to work. He came home to the house with the 2 oaks and the kitchen he'd tiled himself and the British baking show. He stopped watching because there was no one to make the joke to. He was not shattered. He was, more accurately, excavated, hollowed, in a way that felt, strangely, like the beginning of something, rather than the end. He began running in the mornings, not to transform himself, not for any dramatic reason, but because the body he'd found needed somewhere to put what the mind was carrying. He ran 3 miles along the river trail before sunrise and came home and showered and went to work, and in the steadiness of that routine he began, slowly, to recover himself. Not the self that Deborah had married, but something older and quieter. The man he'd been before he'd thought that love required constant management. Deborah, meanwhile, had moved in with Philip by June. Nathan told him, with the careful diplomacy of someone triangulated between 2 people he loved. Raymond thanked him for telling him. Nathan waited for more, and when nothing more came, he said, "You're not angry?" "I'm a lot of things," Raymond said. "Angry is in there somewhere, but it doesn't feel like the most important thing." Philip, as it turned out, was a man of appetites and enthusiasm who had not yet been tested by the ordinary weight of life. By September, Deborah's mother had a health scare, and the logistics of managing it, the hospital visits, the insurance calls, the meal schedules, the quiet, unglamorous labor of loving someone who needed help, fell largely to Deborah alone. Philip was supportive in the way people are supportive from a distance. He sent flowers. He was there for her emotionally. But he was at a stage of life where his own needs occupied most of his available space, and the slow seriousness of what Deborah was navigating required more than he was constitutionally ready to offer. She didn't say any of this to Raymond directly, but Nathan saw it, or the beginning of it, when he visited her in October and found her quieter than he expected, sitting at the kitchen table in the sublet with paperwork spread in front of her and something exhausted in her eyes that he hadn't put there and couldn't fix. He drove back to Cedar Falls and knocked on his father's door. Raymond opened it, still in his running clothes, a mug of coffee in his hand. He looked older than he had a year ago, and also, somehow, more settled, less braced against something, more simply present. "You okay?" Raymond said. Nathan looked at him for a long moment. "I think I've been unfair to you." Raymond stepped back and held the door open. "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where the truth had come out 8 months earlier, and Nathan talked for a long time. He talked about what he'd thought that his father had simply failed to show up, failed to be expressive enough, failed to meet his mother in the emotional register she'd needed. He talked about watching her now, the reality of her new life, and realizing that what she'd been seeking wasn't exactly what she'd found. He said carefully that he didn't think she was happy in the way she'd expected to be. Raymond listened to all of it. When Nathan finished, he said, "She wasn't wrong that I missed things. I did miss things. That part is mine. But, no but, that part is mine." Nathan looked at him. "I've been hard on you." "You were protecting her," Raymond said. "That's right. That's what you should do." She called him in November, and they agreed to meet for coffee at a place downtown that was new enough to carry no shared memory. She arrived 3 minutes after him, in the gray coat he recognized and a scarf he didn't. She looked well and tired and like herself, like the woman he had spent 22 years learning by heart. They sat across from each other and talked, at first about nothing consequential. Her mother, who was recovering. His project in Waterloo. Nathan's promotion. The easy anteroom of the conversation they were both moving toward. Then she set her cup down and said, "I've been thinking about you." Raymond waited. "About us," she said. "About whether we ended things too quickly, whether there might have been another." She stopped. "I've been wondering if we gave up." He looked at her, really looked at her. And he thought about the 22 years of her, the lavender window boxes and the involuntary laugh and the drive to Paul's birthday and the text message on the kitchen counter, and he thought about the months since, the morning runs, the excavated quiet of the house, the slow business of learning again what he actually wanted rather than what he was supposed to want. "I don't think we gave up," he said. "I think we arrived somewhere, and it turned out to be different from what either of us expected, and you made a choice about what to do with that. I made a choice too. We both have to live with them." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not sure I chose well." "Maybe not," he said gently, "but you chose what you needed to choose at the time. I understand that now better than I did." She looked at him with something that was not quite hope, but was adjacent to it. The expression of someone who has left a place and returned to find that the door is not locked, only closed. "Is there aversion?" she began. "Deborah." His voice was not unkind. "You chose excitement. I choose peace." She held his gaze for a long moment. He held hers. Then she nodded, slowly, with the particular dignity of a person who has understood something that costs them. They finished their coffee. They talked about Nathan for another half hour with genuine warmth. They walked out into the November air and said goodbye in the parking lot with a hug that lasted long enough to mean what it meant, which was, "I knew you. I am glad I knew you. I am not coming back." Raymond drove home along the river road with the windows cracked, cold air moving through the car. The oaks in the front yard had gone bare again, their arms empty against the early dark sky. He sat in the driveway for a minute before going inside. He had spent 22 years building a marriage the way he built bridges, for load-bearing, for permanence. What he understood now, sitting in the November quiet, was that some things are not built to be permanent. Some things are built so that you can learn what permanent feels like, and then, finally, choose it for yourself. He went inside. He made dinner. He ate at the table without his phone. It was enough. It was, he found, more than enough.